Well, Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is VBS Torah Study for Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein in the cold but sunny Southern California, joined by my teacher and friend, Rabbi Mark Gelman from rainy and cold South Florida. Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Shabbat Shalom, Mark.
Shabbat shalom, my dear friend.
We're delighted to have you with us to study this afternoon, this morning, this evening, whenever you're picking us up. It's really good to be together. This morning, we turn the page in the Torah because the Torah is going to have a distinctly different flavor from here forward, at least for the next several months, because we have arrived at Mount Sinai. God has come to us and cemented a covenant with the people Israel. And that covenant expresses itself in law. This week's Torah portion is called Mishpatim, which just simply means laws. And it is a compendium, an anthology of a whole series of laws, civil laws, criminal laws, ritual laws that God has commanded the people Israel. And at the end of the portion, the people Israel will accept these laws and declare Naseh v'nishma. We will listen to them, we will observe them, we will do them. This is who we are. Now, that what law is in itself is a remarkable expression of religion. We don't usually think of religion in terms of law. We think of religion as coming from the heart. We think of religion as a set of beliefs and perhaps rituals that symbolize those beliefs. But you remember that the Torah is all about not just taking the people out of Egypt, but getting the Egypt out of this people, forming of this people a sacred community, creating of this people a gathering of just and merciful individuals. And law is God's tool for changing human beings and changing human communities. And within this Torah portion, there are a whole series of laws dealing with liabilities and rights and responsibilities, all of the issues that go along with legal philosophy. Among them are questions, for example, of what does it mean to defend yourself? The law of the Torah is that if somebody comes to kill you, you're permitted to kill him first. The law is that if a thief breaks into your house and he threatens the life of your family, you're permitted to kill him first. The law is that if somebody sets a trap, if somebody leaves a pit open, even if it's inadvertent, and someone falls into the pit, the owner of the pit is liable first for the bodily damage and then for the death of the person who might fall in. And all of these questions are so reminiscent of the condition we find ourselves in today as we look toward Israel. It's now the 120th something day of this catastrophe when a pogrom, as it were, came across the border in Israel, took 1,200 lives, took 236 hostages, and Israel now has responded forcefully to destroy Hamas, rescue the hostages. And the whole world has gathered, unfortunately, against Israel to question the justice of this response and question the motives of Israel and its leaders. And the question is this a just war? Are we engaged in an act of self-defense? How do we look upon ourselves? How do we look upon ourselves as we're doing this? Can we justify this, not just in the eyes of the International Criminal Court, but really, can we justify this in front of our own children? Can we justify this war as a moral and a moral and a righteous effort, or have we crossed the line? Have we gone too far? Is there such a line, or is any kind of revenge, any kind of response of self-defense in itself illegitimate? These are the questions that all of us are asking, and these are questions that are precisely suggested by this Torah portion. Mark, where are we today?
Oh my God. Don't we have any easy questions? We used up all our easy questions in our previous
No.
sessions. Those are the great gnawing questions of our time and probably for generations. because this is an event that will echo through the years. Let's begin with the fundamental understanding that there are religions that teach nonviolence. Their attitude toward physical attack is simple. You should never resist. You should never attack. You should never take revenge. You should never cause harm to anyone else at any time for any reason. It's called in Buddhism and Hinduism, it's called ahimsa in the East, and Christianity has the famous passage from Matthew on the Sermon on the Mount with if someone slaps you on the cheek, you should turn the other cheek, and you should let him slap you on that. And so there is a deep-seated tradition of nonviolence in Christianity. The great Jewish scholar Reuven Kimmelman, Zal, wrote a great essay on nonviolence in Judaism, tried to, do you remember?
I think he's still living.
Is he?
Yeah, I
Oh,
think so.
God.
At
Oh,
Brandeis University.
forgive me, Reuven.
Yavadel b'chaim. You should live long and
Yeah,
be
yeah,
prosperous, Reuben.
exactly.
Professor
Yeah,
Kimmelman.
exactly. His essay was one of the great essays I have ever read on the subject. So he tried to bring the sort of Jewish support for nonviolence in the different peripheral sources. I remember back in the 60s when certain friends of mine wanted to become conscientious objectors. And basically, the draft boards got the message, you're Jewish. You can't claim to be a pacifist.
Mhm.
So basically, Judaism is not willing to embrace the notion that all acts of violence in response to violence are immoral. It does not accept that. It accepts that some reactions to attack are entirely legitimate. Well, that's a difficult position to hold, but it's also a difficult position to consistently hold a position of nonviolence. The classic argument against nonviolence, of course, is what you wouldn't have fought against Hitler. You wouldn't have tried to stop Hitler. So I think the first place we have to begin in our post October 7th understanding is that as tough as it is, as bloody as it is, the response to an attack must be a war of self-defense to eliminate the rodef, the pursuer. Because Hamas is a rodef, that's the Hebrew for someone who's coming to try and kill you. They say they're trying to kill you. They did come and kill us, and they want to come and kill us again. So it's foolish and stupid and inconsistent with Jewish teachings to simply say, well, we don't want to hurt anyone else, and we don't want to do anything to resist them. So once you accept that resistance to evil is not immoral, you then are in what they call the fog of war. Is this act too much? Is it too much to bomb or not to bomb? And I think on that, the arbiters that we have to rely on are the people who actually know what they're doing. We have to rely on morally informed military leaders. I want to tell our viewers about one of the most noble elements of Israel, which is the doctrine called Tohar HaNeshek. Tohar HaNeshek is one of the great achievements of the state of Israel. It means literally the purity of arms, of armaments. And what it teaches every single Israeli soldier, which is every single Israeli 18-year-old, when they go into service, is it teaches them that there is a moral judgment that they must make about the use of deadly force. And that this is not just the rules of general warfare. These are Jewish rules, and they are extremely strict. And many Israeli soldiers have died because they were observing Tohar HaNeshek, the going house to house, rather than, look, what America did in World War II in Dresden and Hamburg and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is just flatten the place. And there are people who say, why don't they just do that? Just bomb from the air. No Israeli soldiers would ever be killed. They've lost over 200 Israeli soldiers up at this point in the war. And the reason is Tohar HaNeshek. Now, have they killed too many in this attack or that attack? Perhaps. Undoubtedly so. But that's what happens in a morally legitimate act of self-defense. So you have to just kind of be courageous in defending an ugly but necessary act.
So my teacher was David Hartman, Rabbi David Hartman in Israel. And
Yes.
Hartman had a particularly interesting flavor of Zionism. He grew up in Brooklyn, of course, went to yeshiva, became a rabbi, was rabbi in Montreal. And in 1969, he and his family came to Israel, moved in 1970 to Israel. Hartman's Zionism was a really interesting sort of take on religious Zionism. He said, for all of these centuries, we have told the world, and most of all told ourselves, that we are this morally superior, morally sensitive, morally genius people. And the evidence for our moral genius was all of these books that we wrote, the Talmud and the law codes and all of the responsa, all of this beautiful, beautiful moral literature. But we never really had to do much with it because very little of our lives was in our hands to control. The most of the serious legal issues or more practical issues of life were held by the powers amidst who we live. Coming to Israel, it all becomes ours. It all becomes ours. And so you've told the world that you are morally superior. Great, let's see it. Israel is the great empirical test of the moral genius of the Jewish people. And so the questioning, and I have to tell you, there are those who are protesting what Israel's doing. There's no more self-critical society than Israel. There's something like 12 daily newspapers in a country because there's an ongoing, vibrant, and sometimes vicious debate about every policy, about every move, and particularly about this war. There's a great deal of unity in Israel about the justice of this war. There's a great deal of unity supporting the soldiers who are fighting it. But the truth is, it's a great deal of consternation about each and every move, about whether it's moral, as you said it is. Tohar HaNeshek is in fact the application of Hartman Zionism. One of the ironies is that the code of Torah HaNeshek, the ethics of the Israeli army, the actual document was written by Moshe Halbertal, who was one of David Hartman's students. And the idea is that this was a code that incorporated Jewish values into the kinds of laws and laws that govern the conduct of the military, right? Rules of engagement, as it were. And so they're trying, but the problem, of course, is that you're fighting an asymmetrical war. See, if it's a war between two armies and both sides are wearing uniforms, and there's a basic understanding of how a war is fought, you have a certain kind of ethics. What do you do for an army that hides within a civilian population? What do you do for an army that keeps its weapons and its supplies under hospitals and inside schoolrooms? What do you do when it uses ambulances to transport its munitions? What do you do when it wears no uniforms and hides amidst the population? What do you do? How do you fight such a war without, on the one hand, destroying the whole population, and on the other hand, get the bad guys? And that is the great dilemma. And then when you add to that an intensely moral conversation, that makes it doubly hard and triply hard when the whole world is watching you. This is the first war fought on social media. This is the first war in the world's history where everyone can watch in real time what's happening to people all over. And it's such a difficult thing. And I think what people tend to forget is that, as you said a moment ago, the people who are fighting this war are not college professors, as you are, with a doctorate in ethics. They're kids. They're absolutely kids. There was a really unfortunate article in the New York Times which gathered up some of the images that Israeli soldiers have posted on social media. And there were some really troubling images of making fun of Palestinians or making fun of their victims. But then you looked at what is it? It's kids. There's 18, 19-year-old kids who have been put in harm's way, who are holding weapons, facing enemies. Sometimes they can see them, sometimes they can't. And the question is, how on earth do you inculcate a sense of moral responsibility? That, I think, is the underlying text of this week's Torah portion. It's one thing to make a commandment and say, okay, if someone comes to kill you, you're allowed to stop him using force, but only so much force. It's one thing to say that, but to be standing in that situation, and to be standing in that situation as not a fully formed human adult, trying to figure out, well, I'm holding the gun and he's holding a gun, and what am I supposed to do? It's such a fraught moral situation, and you can feel the kind of consternation, the pain of this whole circumstance. I can feel it. I can
Yes,
feel it when I read these news stories.
I agree. That's why I think our response to all our consternation is to have trust in the people who lead the army and the people and the soldiers who are fighting. To be proud of the way they are trying their best to simply eradicate a radical form of evil, while at the same time not killing any civilians. But what is a civilian if everyone is dressed the same?
Right.
And what is a civilian if women are carrying bombs? I mean, no one, and this is where frustration leads to anger on the part of many Jews, and I must say I'm one of them, who try to remember why no one criticized American troops in Afghanistan from facing these problems and maybe doing some excessive things, or no one, you didn't hear those articles. You didn't hear that kind of criticism. But now, because it's Jews defending themselves, you hear the criticism all over the place. And it makes me very angry. I don't I don't think it's fair. I think it's a double standard.
Well, it's more than a double standard. I think it's something that you started with, which is so terribly important. There are people who maintain that any exercise of power is
Yes,
unholy,
yes.
is immoral. There are even Jews who believe this. And so there are Jews who believe this and are so guilty, they're feeling such pain and guilt and shame that Jews are standing up to defend themselves, that they turn this around to a sort of castigation of the whole operation. Now, let's be clear, neither you nor I sanction atrocity. And if there are
Obviously not.
atrocities, whether they're on purpose or mistakes, they have to be called out, and people have to be held responsible for this. Absolutely. I want to make sure that people understand this. You don't
Yes.
kill innocent people, and God forbid you don't kill children who are non-combatants, of course. Of course, that's true. But on the other hand, how the hell do you defend yourself against an asymmetrical enemy who hides behind a civilian population, and in so many cases engages the civilian population as complicit in their campaign? What do you do?
Well,
How do you deal with such a circumstance? That's
my
the
re-
dilemma that the Israeli military is facing right now.
precisely right. And my response is more or as I see it, this just my opinion. As I see it, you fight a war pretty much exactly the way Israel is fighting the war. Now, have they used too much force? I'm not going to be one to say that they have, because I don't know if you call in a bombing strike on a house that is an ammunitions depot, but it has been packed with children and adult and women and children. I don't know how you make that decision.
Mhm.
I don't know how you do that, but those are the hard decisions that the military makes, and you either trust them or you don't. And there, I think, is the heart of the question. The question is, do we trust Israel? And I trust Israel. I trust the people running the army. The political leadership is another matter. I don't trust all of the people who are leading Israel, but I do trust the people who are leading the army and the people who are fighting the war. I trust them. Now, I don't think that trust is misplaced. The problem that I think we're going to have to talk more about is, what does it mean to defend yourself against a pursuer in America? Because there are now people who are marching in the streets saying, kill the Jews. People in America are marching
Mhm.
with anti-Semitic genocidal slogans.
And the thing that's more unnerving than that is that often they cloak themselves in the cloak of social justice and peace.
Yes, yes,
In the name of social justice and peace, they'll
yes,
talk about from the river to the sea. Sometimes they don't even know which river and sea they're talking about. But if they do, they're talking about a river to the sea, which means no Jews. Also means, by the way, no gay people, no uppity women, no
yes,
democracy, but we'll go there another time. But that's what makes it even more unnerving.
yes. And I think the response in America has to be the same, taken with the same seriousness as the response that Israel is making. Obviously, we aren't asking for a military response. We have freedom of speech in this country, but there are ways to respond to the pursuers in America. And you can see some of those responses bearing fruit. After the presidents of the universities had found it difficult to say that genocide would be against the rules of Harvard or
MIT or Penn.
Penn, MIT and Penn, there was a counterattack. And the counterattack was, okay, let's see who these kids are who are signing these petitions
Yeah.
that blame Israel before there was even an invasion of Gaza. They blamed Israel. Let's see who these people are. And let's make sure that every corporation knows who they are so that they won't hire these people. That is entirely legitimate to do.
Hmm.
That is a way of responding to the pursuers here.
Yes. So I want to back up for a minute. I want to back up and take a broader perspective for a moment before we leave this parsha, because I think there's an implicit idea. Ooh, we just had a huge earthquake.
You
Ooh,
okay?
yeah, Yeah, Mark, I'm gonna have to stop because I have to go downstairs and help
Okay,
with
go
the
check it
school.
out.
All
Good
right. Oh,
Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbos, everyone. I'm sorry we have to call the school close. Well, Shabbat Shalom once again. I so apologize for interrupting my conversation with Rabbi Gelman, but we had a rather remarkably strong jolt of an earthquake just a few moments ago. And when that happens, it's our responsibility here in the building to run downstairs and make sure that the children of the school are okay. Everyone's fine. No one got hurt. Power didn't go down. There's no damage to the building. And most of all, most precious of all, nobody was hurt. So I apologize for the interruption. But to finish the thought, this week is Parshat Mishpatim. And if we step back from our conversation about self-defense, the just war, liability, which is all suggested by the mitzvot of this Torah portion, I just want to focus for a moment on the broader perspective that the covenant between Israel and God includes an expectation. And the expectation is that we rise up, that the purpose of this covenant is to take us out of Egypt, to take the Egypt out of us, to turn us into just individuals and a sacred society. And that therefore that morality, even down to the granular level of how I treat my employees and how I treat the animals that I care for on a farm, how I farm the vegetables and how I deal with my money, how I treat the neighbors I live with among, how I treat the criminal who is guilty of a crime and how I adjudicate a crime. All of these very granular questions of day-to-day morality become part of the sacred literature of the Torah because the moral task of creating holy people starts at that level. The moral task of creating spiritual people is not about an ethereal sense of God's presence that I dream about when I close my eyes and meditate. It's how I talk to the people I'm with, how I spend my money, how I deal with the people I have power over, the employees and colleagues I work with and work among, how I treat the people in my family, how I treat the neighbors I live with. That's where holiness happens. And it's in the morality of those day-to-day interactions. It's in the morality of power and powerlessness. It's in the morality of language and money and the morality of interactions of life. That's where this task of creating a sacred community and just souls takes place. And that's what makes Mishpatim such a holy and a wonderful parsha. I remember when I was a graduate student in at Columbia University, I had a seminar, international spiritual education, international religious education, and we were introduced to a very, very important scholar of world religions. Gentleman came from China, had begun his life as a Buddhist and had converted to Christianity and become for some time a missionary, now a professor of Christian spirituality, lectured all over the world. And he stood in front of our seminar, a very small seminar of international students of religious education. And he turned to each of us. We had two Catholic priests in the group, and he said, "My brothers in faith." And he turned to the Protestant ministers that were there and he said, "My brothers in faith," and talked about the things of their faith that they so cherish. It turned, we had a Buddhist monk in the group. He's a really beautiful soul. And he turned to her and him rather, and he turned to the Buddhist woman who was there with him and said, my brother and my sister in faith, and talked about what they shared in Buddhism. There was a Hindu teacher in the group and talked about Hinduism. And then he turned to me. He said, "You're a rabbi?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You, I don't understand." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, I read the sacred literature of so many peoples. I read the sacred literature of Christianity and the sacred literature of Buddhism. I read the sacred literature of the Hindu and the Muslim. I learned the sacred literature of so many different denominations and religious communities. And then I open yours. And I opened the Mishnah, the Talmud, and I read what's on the first page of the Mishnah. It says two guys walk into the court carrying a shirt, and each one says it's mine, and the other guy says it's mine. And the court has to decide, I don't understand the spirituality of you people. And I laughed and I said, my brother, you're absolutely right. Shnayim ochzim betalis is the first Mishnah that any young child learns when we learn Talmud. And it's the basic fundamental moral question. Two people have a claim to one object. Now, of course, that has resonances in the world, particularly as Rabbi Gelman and I were talking, because it's two peoples claim the same land. Shnayim ochzim betalis. What do you do then? But you see, I said to my friend, to my teacher, I said, you understand that in my faith, spirituality did not begin up here with our relationship with God. Spirituality begins right here with our relationship with each other. And if we can't find the humanity of the other, when we are in dispute over a disputed piece of property, a shirt, an animal, a land, if I forget to see the humanity behind you, behind your claim, if I don't hear your narrative, if I don't acknowledge that you too are created in the image of God, that you too carry a soul within you, if I can't acknowledge that humanity and solve this in a manner which is merciful, just, compassionate, and right, so there is justice in the world, then how can I possibly come before the creator of the world and ask God for mercy, compassion, justice, and the right? And so our spirituality indeed begins with the common everyday disputes of moral dilemmas, with the common everyday arguments and problems that people face, with the excruciating question of how I deal with those over whom I have power and how I deal with those who have power over me. What are my responsibilities? What are my obligations? What are the boundaries of my obligations? What are my rights in these circumstances? And that's where Jewish spirituality begins. Thankfully, it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. The end of our Parsha ends once again with a covenant between the leaders of Israel and God who redeemed them from Egypt. And that I think is a beautiful symbol that we must never get obsessed solely with the ethics of everyday disputes and interactions and transactions. But remember always that these are indicative of a larger task of becoming God's people in the world and creating the world again in God's image to fulfill God's dreams. So thank you for listening. I apologize for the interruption and wish you all a very, very good and quiet Shabbos. And if you're in my neighborhood and you're still shaken from that earthquake, then please take good care and stay well. Shabbat Shalom.